The Fire Emblem series is a franchise that I don't have too long of a history with, but one that I absolutely love regardless. With the latest installment, Fire Emblem Three Houses, being just 2 months away from release, I figured it would be a good time to look back at the previous games of the franchise, and rank them from worst to best. Now I won't be including spin-off games, such as Fire Emblem Warriors, Fire Emblem Heroes, or Tokyo Mirage Sessions #FE. I also won't be including Fire Emblems 1, 2, 3, or 5. 1, 2, and 3 have remakes, which are overall just a better way to judge the games. And I have been unable to gain access to a good English version of Thracia 776, so I haven't been able to play Fire Emblem 5. Every other main series Fire Emblem game was considered, and Fates has been split into its 3 individual paths. This list was really difficult to make. In general, I don't think there are really any bad Fire Emblem games. For the most part, they each have some type of enjoyment and some kind of value. The criteria for judging each game to make this list included how engaging I found the story to be, how memorable the characters, including both villains, and playable units are, how fun I found the gameplay to be, how much replayability the game has, and how good the game is overall. This is of course all just my opinion, and I'm sure other people's rankings will be different, especially near the end of the list. Now then, let's go ahead and see how I rank the games of the Fire Emblem franchise. At the very bottom of the list, we have what I consider to be the only unenjoyable Fire Emblem game, Fire Emblem Fates Revelation. What's there to say about Revelation that hasn't already been said? The story is easily the weakest of the 3, and Fates doesn't even have that strong of a story to begin with. It's filled with a lot of plot contrivances, and things that don't really make sense, but happen anyways. Some example of this include how Leo and Xander leave Nohr after Garen's insanity rant, how basically any Hoshidan royal who isn't Sakura joins Corrin, how everyone trusts Corrin so much they're willing to jump into something that is literally called the Bottomless Canyon, how Nohr and Hoshido unite, especially considering that Fire Emblem Warriors had their alliance much better, how Scarlet died, and basically anything involving Anthony. The plot is just a huge mess overall. The villains are the worst they've ever been. Garen does nothing except give Leo and Xander a reason to join up with Corrin, whereas Hans and Iago are completely irrelevant and just disposed of by the middle of the game. Anankos takes the role of main villain, but he is so boring. At least Garen was cartoonishly villainous to the point that it makes him somewhat memorable. Anankos had a good backstory, being a benevolent dragon and a friend to the King of Vala. Over time, he degenerated and became consumed with rage and saw only destruction. Revelation does nothing with Anankos' backstory to flesh him out, and instead just lets Hidden Truth and Heirs of Fate handle that job. The problem with using DLC to develop your main villain is that the average player who might not purchase the DLC won't see how good Anankos could have been, and instead just sees the disappointment that Revelation delivered. All of this could have been forgiven if the gameplay was good, but Revelation has perhaps the worst gameplay and the worst maps in Fire Emblem. Most of the maps feature one-off gimmicks that don't add anything, and instead slow the entire game down. Once you're in Vala, the entire game focuses almost entirely on the use of Dragon Veins. Because of that, bringing all of the royals and any royal-born children is needed to use the Dragon Veins as quickly as possible to just get it over with. The cast is quite large, but by the end you only get to bring a small number of units, and the majority of them get unused in favor of using the royals. The only good thing I can really say about Revelation is the fact that you get to use both Xander and Ryoma, so that means battles go much faster and you can get through it really quickly. Things can only get better from here on out, because Revelation was just not good and was just disappointment through and through. Up next is Fire Emblem Awakening, and it's an interesting game in the franchise. It was the first game for many new players, and it's often credited for, quote, saving the franchise, since it was meant to be the last one, but then it sold extremely well. Personally, I find Awakening to just be okay. It isn't that bad, but it's fairly weak in many aspects. To start off with is the story. The biggest thing going against Awakening in the story department is that it essentially has 3 different plots. It starts off with the Elise Plagia War, featuring the Mad King Gangrel as the main antagonist. After that is over, we fight against Valm and Emperor Walhart. Finally, the third act features the fight against Valadar and the Grimiel. While these 3 plots are connected, and they do lead into each other rather well, there are still several points in the story where they feel separate and disjointed. There isn't enough of a major connection between these 3 plots, and the threat of Grima. Speaking of Grima, he's supposed to be the main antagonist of Awakening, but he is almost non-existent in Part 1, only occasionally mentioned in Part 2, and very poorly developed in Part 3. Grima is a poor main antagonist, and while he was admittedly fleshed out a bit in Fire Emblem Echoes, that information can't be used to judge how he appears in Awakening. Having these 3 different plots makes it really hard to develop the villains as a whole, and the story feels weaker because of it. Visiting the world of Arcanea again is very nice, and Awakening does a nice job of fleshing out the world and expanding it in the thousands of years since we last saw it. To quickly speak on the 3 villains themselves, Gangrel is very forgettable because he just doesn't connect to the larger plot. Walther is compelling, memorable, and is easily the best villain, but he's so underdeveloped due to his role being stuck in the middle of Plagia and Grimnil. Veladar comes off as generic and power-hungry. Seeing as how he has the most screen time of the three, he should be the most developed, but he's not a good villain. As for playable characters, there aren't too many characters I dislike in Awakening, but a good majority of them just end up being kinda forgettable. What makes this even worse is that the children units are overall so much better than their parents, so the parents get even more forgettable. Whenever I play Awakening, I find myself using the children more than the parents each and every time. Finally, with Awakening, there's the gameplay, which, like the rest of Awakening, is just fine. The maps aren't anything too special, and there isn't any real variety in objectives, but I have to say it's still enjoyable. Pair Up makes the game far too easy, and the game's already really easy as is, so there is absolutely no challenge in Awakening. The lack of challenge, however, doesn't keep the game from being fun to play through. Overall, Awakening is just fine. Not a great game, but not really bad either, and all the good things it did for the franchise should be acknowledged. Shadow Dragon is next, and this is a bit of a tricky one. As a remake of the first game, Shadow Dragon didn't have too much to work with, but I think it delivered very well. There isn't too much to say about Shadow Dragon. The story is quite straightforward, and a bit generic, but again, it was the first game in the franchise, so it can be excused. Similarly, the villains aren't anything too special. Garnif and Medius are average main villains, and they could have been better if given more development, but they serve their purpose just fine. Camus and Michaelis, on the other hand, are great characters and great villains. They make the story much stronger. As for playable characters, these are very likable, though in general they're kind of weak compared to other characters from later in the franchise. Another issue with the playable characters is that there are so many of them that the vast majority of them just end up being very forgettable. I will say the large roster does encourage replayability in trying out different characters, and they're all mostly usable in some way, so that is good. The gameplay works well enough, having its fair share of high points and its fair share of low points. The class swap feature is a nice way of making the game replayable, by trying out different classes for different characters. It also helps for certain situations where one class would be more useful over another. Having Marth go to level 30 rather than promoting might seem like a deficit at first, but once Marth is given Falchion, he doesn't really need to promote anyways. Giving Kata her own personal weapon in the form of a Wing Spear helped her become much more useful and a better unit. I wish that support conversations had been added to flesh out the characters just a little bit more, but it's understandable that they didn't. As for negatives regarding the gameplay in Shadow Dragon, the guidance chapters are the absolute worst decision ever, because you must actively kill off your units in order to achieve them. Having Pegasus Knights promote into Draco Knights isn't something I really liked, and the maps in general just feel kind of empty and dull. I think the biggest issue Shadow Dragon has is it feels a little outdated, even when comparing it to the GBA games. Those games have aged better than Shadow Dragon has. Still, most of Shadow Dragon's problems can be excused away because it is a remake of the first game in the franchise. It's a good game to play through each and every time, it offers a lot, and it's good enough for being a remake of the first game. Oh boy, here comes the controversy, because at number 10 we have Fire Emblem Echoes, Shadows of Valentia. Echoes is somewhat like Shadow Dragon, where a lot of its problems can be explained away because it's a remake of an earlier game. The main one of these being the story once again falling into the category of kind of basic. Echoes did expand on the story in some really strong ways, and they made it a lot better, but overall it doesn't really stand out when compared to the stories of other games. One thing I did enjoy about the story was how it progressed through both Alm and Celica on different ends of the map until the end when they united. The two of them worked well together to tell a larger connected story, and at the same time they had their own individual stories that developed them and their cast. The villains are a bit of a mixed bag. Duma is pretty bad, Jeddah is pretty boring, Rudolph is okay but confusing, although the new villain of Berkut is just amazing. The addition of Berkut is one of the strongest things Echoes adds to the original, as his character is great, his story is wonderful, and he's a powerful character. Overall, the new characters that Echoes added are all really great additions to the cast, and I love all of them. Almost everything else that Echoes does well, it does amazingly well. The characters are all good and likable, whether they be on Alm's path or Celica's path. The dungeon exploring is a lot of fun, it makes the game unique, and I wish it would come back. The lack of a weapon triangle mixes up combat, forging weapons to create weapon skill is really fun, and it leads to some powerful weapon creations. Archers are a lot of fun to use, the cutscenes are a beauty to look at, Milla's Turnwheel is the greatest device that has ever existed, the voice acting is phenomenal, and the game is fully voiced. Now you might be wondering, why is Echo so low if I have so much praise for it? And there is one big reason why. That is Celica's path. Celica's path is one of the worst paths in Fire Emblem. At the start of the game, you have to go through several boat maps. Boat maps are painfully slow. Not to mention, most of your units will die unless you have Saber defending them, because they are weak and they cannot take hits. Then after you deal with the boats, you have to deal with Draco zombies, who can once again kill almost all of your units very easily. After this, you're sent into desert maps, where everything moves so slowly. And once you're out of the desert, well, you're thrown into a swamp, where things are even more slow. All of this while dealing with endlessly swarming Cantors that drag out these slow maps and make them painfully long. Celica's path is a pain to play through because it's tedious, annoying, monotonous, repetitive, and slow. Having the Pegasisters does help, but it's still really slow because your units just don't move. You don't even get to enjoy the new character of Conrad, because he's a horse unit, and Celica's path actively hates horse units with how slow they move. Furthermore, Celica herself just isn't that great of a character. She's a little hypocritical towards Alm, and she makes the most idiotic decisions in the last act of the game. Echoes is very good, very strong, it's solid, it's a great remake of an old game. But with Celica's path dragging it down so much, the best I can do is just give it number 10. Okay, if that last one didn't get controversy, this one definitely will, because the number 9 spot goes to Fire Emblem Blazing Blade. Blazing Blade was the first Fire Emblem game to get released outside of Japan, and for many people it was their first Fire Emblem game. Older fans of the franchise hold this game in very high regard, although I think part of it might just be nostalgia. Don't get me wrong, this game's really good, it's solid, and I do enjoy it thoroughly. I just prefer the other games to come more, and I think they do a better job with most of the aspects. Now I have to give this game credit for its uniqueness when it comes to story. Rather than centralizing on an invading army or a continental war, Blazing Blade is a much smaller and more contained story. This is both a good thing and a bad thing in my opinion. On the one hand, the smaller scale makes it more personal, and it helps to develop the cast. On the other hand, the fact that the story was as small as it was, means there wasn't too much room for world building. There's a good amount of nations that only get mentioned in passing, that we never get to see, to experience, or to visit. The story works well with what it wants to tell, but it's dragged down quite a bit because the main villain of Nurgle just isn't that good in my book. Nurgle is one of my least favorite main villains, because he is so underdeveloped and comes off as boring. Even though Eliwood is the lord that Nurgle has the most against and he has a personal vendetta with, Nurgle's backstory is instead told through guidance chapters in Hector's story. Now I'm fine with additional content, extra chapters, and extra modes, because all of that encourages replaying the game. But I feel having development for the main villain is not something that should be hidden away behind a secret chapter. Nurgle has nothing to offer the story, and he brings it down as a whole. Thankfully, while Nurgle isn't that good of a villain, the Black Fang are amazing antagonists, and they carry the story entirely. Each of them are great characters, they're all compelling, they all have amazing stories to tell, and I love each and every one of them. The number of our playable units is very good. It's not too big, and it's also not too small. They're all pretty good characters, and picking which units to use is often hard, with how much I like the majority of them. Kent and Sane, for example, are my favorite versions of Cain and Abel, and Florina is one of my favorite units in all of Fire Emblem. Having 3 different lords and having each one play differently was a genius idea, and it was implemented very well in the game. Each lord is unique, different, and enjoyable. Gameplay is fun, and the maps have all aged rather well. There aren't too many frustrating maps, and Hector mode is an authentic challenge for people who enjoy that. Lynn's mode is an overglorified tutorial, but you only have to play it once, and even then it's a good standalone story. It develops the characters, and it's interesting. Blazing Blade is a strong and standard Fire Emblem game. It doesn't have too much going against it, but at the same time, it just isn't as strong as those to come. Next is the path of Fire Emblem Fates that I felt had the best potential. That being Fire Emblem Fates Conquest. The idea of siding with the quote evil army isn't something that has been explored too much in Fire Emblem, and this was a perfect opportunity to do just that. Unfortunately for us, Conquest drops the ball, and what we ended up getting instead is perhaps the most idiotic version of Corrin in any of the 3 paths. The lengths that Corrin goes to please Garen are just absurd, and it's even more absurd that only 2 of the Hoshidan royals end up dead by the end of the invasion. It's not just Corrin who basically follows Garen either, no. Basically every Norian royal subjects to him without any independent thought of their own. While they do say they don't fully agree with Garen's methods, they never demonstrate any actions to show this. They're all talk, but they never act on those words. What could have been an interesting look at the darker side of war, the idea of starting rebellion from within the royal family, ended up being turned down in favor of an overly convoluted plot to get Garen to sit on a magic chair. This path offered the best opportunity to develop Garen, Iago, and Hans, but none of them are any different from how they are in the other paths. All of this being said, I don't consider the story to be completely terrible the way Revelation is. When we do get to Hoshido, the Hoshidan royals defending their kingdom features some pretty strong moments in the game. Takumi's arc throughout the game is a rather well done arc, and he works wonderfully as a surprise final boss. Although I do have to say that boss fight is a bit harder than it needs to be, but that's not the point. For as much as I criticize the Norian royals, their reaction to seeing Slime Garen is genuinely tragic, and it's much better than how they react to Garen's actions in Revelation. What especially helps this game from being much worse is the gameplay and the playable cast. I didn't like the Norian units at first, but they grew on me so quickly. Fitting with the theme of Nor being the darker kingdom, almost every character has some sort of dark past or tragedy befalling them. The supports are probably the best in Conquest because the Norian characters have so much more to them and they're fleshed out very well. As for the gameplay, Conquest is one of the hardest Fire Emblem games, and most of it isn't artificial difficulty. There are a few maps that have a ridiculous gimmick, but most of them are innovative, unique, and genuinely difficult. Conquest could have been a much better game if it had a deeper story, but for what we got, I still think it has enough to be considered a strong game and a strong entry in the franchise. There aren't too many times where Fire Emblem games get direct sequels, but the next entry on the list is a great example of why there should be more direct sequels in Fire Emblem. That being Fire Emblem New Mystery of the Emblem. New Mystery takes everything that was good about Shadow Dragon and makes it even better. The relationship between Marth and Keita is a strong one, as they are engaged to be married. They already had some pretty good chemistry in Shadow Dragon, and now in New Mystery, they work so well together. They have amazing moments, and I love them. Camus, now going by Sirius, and Michaelis are now playable characters. They were the best villains in Shadow Dragon, and having them as playable units just furthers their already amazing development. The story is a good one, because at several points we end up having to fight against units from Shadow Dragon. While many of these units can be recruited back to our side, fighting against those who once fought alongside us is a powerful concept that New Mystery executes very well. You can really see the pain these characters are going through, fighting against those they once called friends. Hardin as a main villain is one of the best in the franchise because of the close personal connection that he has to Marth. Rather than just trying to invade immediately, Hardin uses his friendship with Marth to manipulate him at the start of the game. Hardin was one of the units that I commonly used in Shadow Dragon, so on a personal level, I could really feel what Marth was feeling when he had to fight Hardin. Slowly recruiting the Wolf Guard and fighting them at several points in the story, seeing the despair they felt knowing their friend, their comrade, was no longer the man that he once was, it's painful, it's emotional, it's a powerful moment. The prologue and the guidance chapters featuring Chris and Katrina, they might not connect to the main story directly, but they're amazingly well done. They feature great character moments as well. New Mystery features the largest cast of playable characters in the franchise, with 77 characters. A lot of them might end up fading into obscurity, but there are plenty of strong characters and a lot to love. The pseudo-support conversations with Chris helps to flesh out an already great roster. The maps and the gameplay are still just a bit on the weaker end, but it's a major step up from Shadow Dragon. Honestly, my only major point of criticism is that Garneth and Medius don't get any development at all and still come off as being generic and boring. Had New Mystery fleshed them out, and maybe featured just a few more stronger maps, I would really see it being a top 5 game. As is though, New Mystery is a wonderful example of why we need more direct sequels and a great story that continues the tale of Marth. Finally, we arrive at the last of the 3 Fates paths, Fire Emblem Fates Birthright. Birthright holds a special place in my heart, as it was the first Fire Emblem game that I played. For a long time, it was my favorite Fire Emblem game. As I played more games and thought more about Birthright, I realized it isn't the perfect game I once thought it was, but it's still a very strong game in my opinion. The story is bland and generic admittedly, but you know, I'll take a generic story over the contrived mess that Revelation is, and the idiotic mess that Conquest is. Garen, Hans, and Iago work best in Birthright, because even though they're still bland and generic, they don't need to be much more than a constant antagonistic force. Fighting against them felt so much more satisfying, because of how much they antagonized you over the course of the game. It felt earned when you fought and defeated them. Fighting against the Norian siblings in Birthright is a lot more emotional when compared to fighting against the Hoshidan siblings in Conquest. While some may criticize Xander's actions in Birthright, I honestly think he exemplifies the Camus archetype to the extreme, and he does a good job with that. Leo is my favorite character in Birthright, and its characterization here is the main reason I decided to play Conquest, whereas I previously had no interest in it. The characters in Birthright are some of my favorites in Fire Emblem. Part of this may be the fact that it was the first cast I was fully exposed to, but I thoroughly enjoy all of them, and I use different units each time I play. Ryoma is one of my favorite Fire Emblem characters to use anytime, and his playstyle is probably one of the largest reasons why I love Swordmaster so much. As for the maps, they are just pretty standard maps and don't offer too much diversity. This isn't too big of a problem for me, and I find Birthright to be fully enjoyable. Birthright is the Fire Emblem game that I have played the most times, having played it a total of 6 different times as of the recording of this video. Each playthrough offers so much more to me, whether it be the different units I use, having different classes, having different pairs, exploring more of the supports, or just experiencing the story once more, because even though it's a bland and boring story, I still love it as it was my entry into the franchise. It has a lot of faults, but it's a game I will always cherish, always enjoy returning to, and it's a game that I hold highly. From the number 5 spot onward, it was excruciatingly difficult to sort them out. Each one of these games has great stories, great villains, great characters, and great gameplay, so ranking them requires a bit more thought. In the end, I decided to give the number 5 spot to Genealogy of the Holy War. Genealogy gets the number 5 spot, because while it manages to do so much well, it has some weaker points that just make it fall short of the remaining 4. The story in Genealogy is perhaps the darkest story in all of Fire Emblem. It's a great one, but the biggest issue I have is the entire thing progresses far too quickly due to the nature of the game. Since Genealogy focuses more on large and expansive maps spanning several castles that must be seized, the main story itself is contained in only 10 chapters. These 10 chapters are then split into 2 different generations, thus each generation only has about 5 chapters to work with. The game manages to tell a wonderful, compelling story in only these small amount of chapters, far better than what I would have expected, but there are still some details that just feel a little rushed. Sigurd and Dairday's relationship, for example, is extremely rushed. They meet in the first chapter, are married by the second chapter, and then she's abducted by the third chapter. There's not enough time to develop their relationship, or give them too many memorable moments together. Another example of a rushed plot is Eldigan. He's a good example of the Camus archetype, and I do like him, but I just wish we saw more of him. He shows up in one chapter, and then just a few chapters later, he fights you, betrays his kingdom, and is killed. All of that happens within the same chapter, and it leads to his character being rushed. One of the things that makes the Camus archetype so interesting is that we see them at various points in the story. We see them struggle with doing what they believe to be right, and doing what they must do as a loyal soldier. Camus are often the most developed villains, but Eldigan just lacks this development. Along with rushed plots, something that brings the game down is that the second generation is nowhere near as compelling as the first one in any way. Sigurd is better than Seliph. Quan is better than Leif. Arvis is better than Julius. The units overall are better in Generation 1 than they are in Generation 2. The plot of Generation 1 is more interesting, and the plot of Generation 2 is kinda generic. The maps in Generation 1 are better. Generation 2 is so much weaker than Generation 1 that playing through the start of it feels like such a chore, especially after the huge build-up that Generation 1 had. The last 2 chapters of Generation 2, as well as Endgame, managed to save Generation 2 from being completely boring and dull, because they are great chapters, they're full of emotion, and they're fun to play with. The end result is a great beginning, a painful middle, and a beyond satisfying ending. The gameplay and maps in Genealogy are a bit of a mixed bag. With how large the maps are, and how much time is spent on each map, they either end up being a lot of fun to play through, or a boring chore that just drags on. As an older game, some of the combat and systems are a bit outdated. The arena is perhaps my favorite feature, as it is not exploitable the way the GBA arena is, and it also isn't completely useless the way the Fates arena is. I do wish there was an easier way to keep track of love points between units, because sometimes my units ended up falling in love without me even realizing it, especially in Generation 2, where I cared much less about romances. It's also hard to keep track of everyone's parents in Generation 2, because there's no real way to check. Holy Blood and Holy Weapons drastically overpower any other unit, to the point where someone who doesn't have Holy Blood is kinda useless comparatively. Having separate funds for individual units, rather than a single set of funds, creates some difficulty in resource management, but it does work and it's a lot of fun, especially since repairing weapons is more effective than buying new ones. In general, I think the gameplay and the features hold up well, but a remake to refine some of the mechanics wouldn't hurt either. A remake, however, could be a detriment to the story, especially if they have to censor out some of the riskier parts, such as the incest and the implied rape. Genealogy is a very different game from the rest of the Fire Emblem franchise, but its uniqueness helps it to stand out, and it does well far more than what it misses the mark on. Number 4 goes to Fire Emblem Binding Blade. The way I see Binding Blade is, what would happen if New Mystery of the Emblem was a better version of itself? There are a lot of parallels between New Mystery and Binding Blade, from character designs, plot points, and overall themes. The story in Binding Blade isn't too different from a standard Fire Emblem story, but the amazing characters carry it all the way through and help it to stand out. The villains are all top tier villains, each being fully fleshed out and developed. Zephiel is one of the strongest main villains in the franchise, being sympathetic and a lot more morally gray in his reasoning rather than truly being evil. Gale is one of the best Camus in the franchise. His battle dialogue with Milady is emotional, tragic, and heartbreaking. Murdoch's loyalty to Zephiel extends to even from before Zephiel was king. He serves Zephiel not only because he respects him, but he admires him as well, and cares for him. Bronya similarly is loyal to the point where she abandoned Zephiel after he ordered it, and she continues to fight even after he has died, knowing that's what he wanted. Bronya is also compassionate herself, as she allows any soldier to leave the final battle should they wish, knowing it was a suicide battle. Narshin is a fun villain because of his vanity and arrogance. He's killed early on so he doesn't overstay his welcome, but he's memorable nonetheless. Idun is a tragic villain of circumstances. Getting the true ending is the best outcome for her, and it encourages the player to go for it every time. John is the weakest villain in the game, but even he has an aura of mystery to him. He's interesting, and while he's never explored too deeply, he does a really strong job of showcasing the dynamic that humans and dragons once held. The world of Binding Blade is fleshed out wonderfully, receiving good lore, and getting to visit many of the nations mentioned. The number of playable units is really large, and while some do end up as forgettable, the vast majority of characters are great. Percival, Milady, Zeiss, Cecilia, Douglas in particular, are late game units that I always try to save room for because I can't wait to reach them. The fact that these characters also show up periodically throughout the beginning of the story and the middle makes it far more satisfying when you finally get the ability to use them for yourself. Roy is honestly one of my least favorite lords, but he isn't terrible, and once he gets the Binding Blade, he'll actually be a really good usable unit. The gameplay is just a tad bit outdated, and there is some iffy RNG every now and then. Overall, I think the game holds up very well. Likewise, the maps are what I consider to be some of the best. There's nothing too frustrating or unenjoyable, with only a couple of notable exceptions. The last maps in the game are some of the strongest maps because of how challenging they can be, while also being very enjoyable. There are a few points in the game where the story diverges, offering a small bit of replayability, just to experience things a slightly different way, but it doesn't have too big of an impact. The guidance chapters are implemented the best way here. They don't have pointless requirements like they did in Shadow Dragon. They don't hide important development like they did in Blazing Blade. They connect to the main story far better than they did in New Mystery, and they reward the player in several different ways, not just with items, but also with story. Regarding a remake of Binding Blade, as many people have suggested, I wouldn't be against it, because fleshing out an already great game would only make it better, but I honestly don't think it's in need of one right now. It holds up very well, and it's an amazing game. Now, while picking 4 and 5 was excruciatingly difficult, trying to decide the top 3 was just unbearably painful for me. I think the hardest thing had to be choosing which was worse between Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn, as they are both phenomenal games. The Tellius games are the best that Fire Emblem has to offer, but which ranks at number 3? The number 3 spot goes to Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn. Radiant Dawn does so much well, and the negatives seem almost non-existent by comparison. For starters, the story is by far the strongest one in all of Fire Emblem. It's the longest in the franchise, and Radiant Dawn tells its story over 5 grand arcs. Each arc has its own individual chapters, but the whole thing is connected to create a vast and expansive story. Unlike in Fire Emblem Awakening, where the different stories felt somewhat disconnected and separate from each other, Radiant Dawn's separate arcs clearly build up to its epic finale. Each arc also manages to give a good amount of character development to the characters that it focuses on. Radiant Dawn has a large cast, but since it's split into these smaller arcs, it's easier for characters to get development and screen time rather than fighting for it. The highlight of Radiant Dawn's story has to be in Act 3, when your armies are fighting each other. New Mystery of the Emblem briefly touched on the idea of former allies going to war with each other, and Radiant Dawn takes that up to 11. It's so well done, and there was clearly a lot of thought put into this. Some characters won't attack certain characters. Other characters can even be recruited to join the enemy side if circumstances are met. This is made even better when switching between armies as these battle progresses, so you can see both sides of the war rather than just the single side that we usually see. Although these maps are difficult and frustrating due to the difference in power amongst the armies, it's a strong act with strong chapters. The final act has a deep sense of eeriness to it, and the stakes are higher than they've ever been before. It all accumulates in the final few battles that have a high sense of tension that have been properly built up to, and that create the best story Fire Emblem has ever told. If I had to say something negative about the story, the Blood Pact is a bit of a plot contrivance. It only exists to move the plot forward, and actually serves as a detriment to several characters' development. Some of the twists and reveals don't work exactly as well as I had hoped they would, but overall it's still very strong. The characters in Radiant Dawn have a lot to offer, and the characters who already appeared in Path of Radiance have some great development to show how they've changed over the years in between. Unfortunately, due to the structure of the game, it is very difficult to utilize many of the characters. The game starts with the Dawn Brigade, who are very weak and frail. There isn't too much time to train them, and the vast majority of them will stay underleveled throughout the time. The Crimean Royal Knights are great units, but they are featured in such a small amount of chapters that there's just no time to train them. When they join up again later, they're below most of your other units, and training them is a waste of time. Ike and the Grail Mercenaries seem to have the opposite problem, where they're just too powerful. They blaze through pretty much every chapter that they're in, and they have no problem gaining experience. By the end, the Grail Mercenaries will probably be your best units, and there just won't be too much of a point of using either the Dawn Brigade or the Crimean Royal Knights. Regarding Lagoos, they aren't bad units, but you get access to so many Royal Lagoos that can stay transformed permanently and that are just far more powerful, that training the weaker Lagoos seems like a waste of experience and times. One of the fun parts of playing a Fire Emblem game multiple times is getting to try out and experience different units. With Radiant Dawn's structure, however, there aren't too many viable units to choose from. Bonus experience and skill transferring can help units become stronger than they initially are, but even then, units such as Meg, Fiona, Tormad, and Makalov are just a waste to train. Then there's characters such as Astrid, Marcia, Leith, Alana, and Elincia who just are nowhere near as good as they were in Path of Radiance. Beyond the issue with characters, Radiant Dawn also has some really terrible maps. The idea to have a high ground and a low ground was interesting, but it was not implemented well at all. The maps in Act 3 are frustrating in the worst way possible. This is when the story is at its best, so it's such a shame that the maps are the weakest here. Radiant Dawn has some of the worst maps in the franchise, which is such a shame when the story and the gameplay are so good. They also have the worst support system in the franchise ever, because it is non-existent and they have one-line supports. While Radiant Dawn has so many things in its favor, it also has plenty of things going against it, and thus it lands in number 3. So if Radiant Dawn is number 3, then what is the penultimate pick? Clearly that goes to Fire Emblem Path of Radiance. Path of Radiance has many points that deserve to be praised. The story is an interesting twist on the classic Fire Emblem formula. Rather than focusing on a member of royalty who has to flee after their kingdom is invaded, Path of Radiance features a mercenary who helps a member of royalty that has to flee after their kingdom is invaded. Most Fire Emblem games would feature Elincia as the protagonist, but having Ike as the main character instead offers a different perspective on the events that unfold. The world of Tellius is fully fleshed out as the story takes us to essentially every major nation. The current tension between nations is truly felt, as we explore the different perspectives they hold with the situation going on and the war with Dayan. What the story manages to do best when exploring the different nations is examine the reality of war and the moral grayness that comes with it. Ike and the Grail Mercenaries are portrayed as invaders to the ordinary citizens of Dayan, even though they're only trying to defend Crimea from being invaded. This perspective is never really explored in any other Fire Emblem game, and it's great to see in Path of Radiance. The characters in Path of Radiance are memorable and likable with just a few exceptions. The support conversations are some of the strongest in the entire franchise, and they help to flesh out these already lovable and memorable characters. Thankfully, Path of Radiance doesn't have any real difficulty when it comes to utilizing a variety of units. Almost everyone can become a great unit, and the game offers a lot of replayability choosing different units and exploring these different characters. The main villain of Ashnard is a weak villain in my book. For a story as good as this one, and one that really wants to focus on the grayness of war, you'd think they'd have a much better villain than a power-hungry generic tyrant. Ashnard is too generic for my taste, and he doesn't offer enough to make him stand out. Thankfully, the secondary villains of Bryce, Bertram, Petrine, and the Black Knight are all able to make up for Ashnard being a generic villain. They honestly carry the story a lot more than he does, and are great villains. Path of Radiance is probably the closest to being a perfect Fire Emblem game, but we still have one more to go. Only one game left, so it's clear what the number 1 pick is. No, not that. I said no spin-offs, remember? Number 1 goes to Fire Emblem Sacred Stones. So what does Sacred Stones manage to do for it to be considered the best Fire Emblem game for me? A lot. The villains in Sacred Stones are what I consider to be the best villains in the entire franchise. Orson is tragic, being distorted by the desire to reunite with his wife. Though he does eventually reunite with her, he's so far gone, he believes it to be actually her, and not the decrepit corpse that she truly is. Kalek is an ambitious person who started from nothing and rose to becoming a head general. His past with Joshua and the interactions that they both have give them great development. While he isn't truly evil, he does everything he feels is in his best interest, and he is very selfish. Selena is another Camus archetype, and she is my personal favorite of said archetype. While most Camus don't really have a reason to serve beyond their sense of loyalty, Selena's loyalty comes from her past, and her history with King Vigard. Had it not been for King Vigard's kindness, her village would have died of famine. She owes the throne not only her life, but the lives of everyone in her village. Despite how twisted the Grotto Empire has become, she cannot turn her back on those who she owes everything to. Voltar is pure sadism. He is one of the most threatening characters because of how sadistic and violent he is. Killing him feels incredibly satisfying, especially if you do it with Erica because of chapters worth of threats towards Erica. His character is fleshed out even more when his backstory with the Cursed Lance is revealed. While this doesn't make him a sympathetic character by any means, it adds so many new layers to him. Finally, there's Leon, who is just a masterful villain. He's tragic, he's sympathetic, he has a personal connection to the main lords, he's interesting, he's well developed, he's memorable, he's relatable, he is the greatest character. The story might not be as strong as the Tellius games or Genealogy, but it is still so strong, so enjoyable, so engaging, so memorable. Along with the great villains, the story is elevated because of how amazing this cast is. Sacred Stones has one of the strongest rosters, but I love every single character in this game. With other Fire Emblem games, there are often characters that end up forgettable or unusable, but every single playable character in Sacred Stones offers something of value to me. They're all so great, so fun to use, not too hard to train thanks to the game's easier difficulty, they have great supports, they work well together, and they make my favorite cast of characters in the entire franchise. The main lords of Erica and Ephraim work incredibly well together, they have a unique dynamic, and even when they're separated, the pair are still strong and compelling characters. They contrast heavily in personality, as well as how they interact with Leon, since he was friends with them. Myrrh is a tragic character who suffers a lot throughout the story, only to get a somewhat happy and bittersweet ending in the end. Sacred Stones is a lot of fun to play, having relatively simple but thoroughly enjoyable maps. The split between Erica's path and Ephraim's path is a minor difference, but it does offer a level of replayability. Sacred Stones is a game that I love to come back to so many times. I've played it 5 times, and each time, whether it be different units, different promotions, different paths, each playthrough has offered me something fresh, something new, something enjoyable, something to love. I love almost everything about Sacred Stones. If I were being 100% purely objective, then yes, one of the Tellius games would probably be number 1, but I cannot deny how much this game means to me and how much I love it. On a personal level, I connected so much to the themes prevalent in the story, and a lot of the character development works so beautifully for me. While Birthright is officially the first Fire Emblem game that I played, Sacred Stones technically deserves that title, because I played about 5 chapters on an emulator early in high school at the suggestion of one of my friends before my computer ended up crashing. I wish I had been able to finish this game when I was in high school, because it is just so beautiful and it really could have helped me out throughout that time. With all of this said, Fire Emblem Sacred Stones is, in my opinion, the best Fire Emblem game in the franchise, and I don't think there's going to be a game that will be able to top it for some time to come. What do you think about the way that I rank the games? Is there anything in particular you agreed with or disagreed with? Did I rank one of your favorite games too low, or did I hype up a game that you disliked too much? I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments below. Fire Emblem Three Houses isn't too far away, and I am looking forward to it immensely. I feel like I'm gonna love this game, and I can't wait to see where it compares to the past 13 games. And hopefully I'll get a chance to play Thracia 776, because as of the production of this video, it was released in English and I'm getting on that right now. Hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you all next time.